Welcome. We're going to be in Genesis chapters 20 to 22 today. And before we do that, we'll do a very quick summary of what we covered before. You had Genesis chapter 1, 6 days of creation. Genesis chapter 2, day of rest. The seventh day, specific creation of male and female. Chapter 3, the fall. Chapter 4, Cain and Abel. Chapter 5, genealogies. And we get more genealogies all the way up to chapter 11, finishing with that genealogy, introducing us to the character of Abram. And we have been in Abram's kind of narrative line for quite some time now. And we're still talking about Abram. And he's now Abraham since chapter 17. But first in chapter 12, we see the command that God gives to Abram to leave his land, to leave his relatives, his father's house, to the land which God will show him, the land of Canaan. Blessing is promised, and Abram went. That's pretty much how it goes. He obeys the Lord, he goes out, but there's some issues. There's a famine in the land, so he goes down to Egypt, unfortunately, and bad things happen there. He acts deceitfully. He says that Sarai is not his wife, but rather his sister. We'll see that's technically kind of correct in the chapters we'll read today. So it's technically correct, but he was still acting deceitfully. And Pharaoh was not happy about that, but still blesses Abraham materially. And those material blessings do have consequences, however. Chapter 13, they have so many possessions now that the land can't support them. And Abram is now forced to separate with one of his last relatives, Lot, his nephew, who went with him. So they separate. Lot goes to the area of Sodom. And in chapter 14, a number of kings come down from the northeastern area. They're not happy with the kings down near Lot's area. And they take him over, attack him, and they also take Lot with them, along with other spoils of war. So Abraham then goes ahead and risks his life to take back his nephew Lot. He succeeds by God's grace and providence, and he also goes ahead and receives a blessing from Melchizedek, and also pays tithes to Melchizedek as well. We don't have the time to go into who Melchizedek is, but we already did that in a previous study. Chapter 15, Abram is promised a son, and we keep getting more information about the promise that God has given to Abram. So now we know that involves a son, that we could have implied that already about Abram being the father of a multitude of nations, that would involve a son. But now we're specifically told it does involve a son. And so chapter 16, then after we hear about this promise for a son, Abram and Sarai try to make that happen themselves. They try to force it to happen, unfortunately. And so they bring Hagar in, their Egyptian servant, who was most likely one of the servants they received from Pharaoh back a few chapters earlier, where we looked at some consequences in chapter 12 of that. So they probably got that Egyptian servant from Pharaoh, who gave them male and female servants. And so they say, okay, Abram, how about you just have relations with this Egyptian maid, and then we'll get a son. But that's not the way that God wanted them to do it. And Sarah even acknowledges in chapter 16, verse 2, that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. So they know that it's the Lord doing this to them, but instead of waiting for God to fulfill the promise, they try to force it to happen themselves in a bad way. So there are consequences of that. And Ishmael is born when Abram was 86 years old, according to verse 16. So Ishmael is born, and unfortunately, the Ishmaelites will become a perennial enemy to Israel. And we'll talk more about Ishmael in the chapters we'll read. But chapter 17, we have the covenant of circumcision and another reaffirmation of the promise to Abram. And his name changes in chapter 17 to Abraham. So the covenant of circumcision, that physical sign in the flesh of the Israelites to remind them of this promise and to remind them of their land that God has given them. Chapter 18, the birth of Isaac is promised, and Abraham was about 99 years old at this time, because he was 99 when he was circumcised. Chapter 18 occurs during that period, and in 1 year, Isaac should be born. So then we get into chapter 19, which shifts the focus. Okay, we're talking about Abraham a lot. Now we're going to talk about Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah, whose wickedness has risen up to the Lord, and he will judge them with fire and brimstone. And then we get into chapter 20, which is what we're going to start reading with. So if you could go to the Bible Study React channel, if you want to volunteer to read, just go to that channel, react to that message, and I'll have people to call on to read. So one person has already reacted. It's Dogman. So we're going to get into reading chapters 20 to 22. Now chapter 20 is going to have a lot of familiarities and similarities with chapter 12, where we talked about Pharaoh and how Abram acted deceitfully, and now Abraham is going to act deceitfully again, in pretty much the exact same way. So just bear that in mind. Look for some of the similarities there, and look for some of the differences between those two accounts, chapter 12 with Pharaoh, and chapter 20 now with Abimelech, the king of Gerar. Whenever you're ready, Dogman, could you read the entire chapter? Yeah. All right, thanks. So just a reminder to everyone, if you're not talking, it's usually nice to have your microphone muted. So I sent a little screenshot there to show where the little button is, just for everyone. And I think most people do that. So I think that's helpful, just so that we can watch out for background noise and things like that. All right, so chapter 20 begins with verse 1. Abraham, I'm going to keep messing that up, from there toward the land of the Negev, and settled between Kadesh and Shur, and then he sojourned into Gerar, which Abimelech is king of. That's where the story begins for Abimelech. So we know that Abraham was most likely still at the Oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron. So we learn that from chapter 18. The Lord appeared to him by the Oaks of Mamre, and then chapter 19 is just about Lot, and we don't see Abraham really moving anywhere. So it's most likely that's the location where he was. So let me just bring up a quick map for us to see where Abraham journeys, and there's actually, unfortunately, no little lines to help guide us here. So there's the map. And actually, I'm gonna draw some lines. So study out that map. I sent it in the Discord chat. You can start looking at the different areas and where they are and things like that. And I'm going to have to expand this map as well. So if you look at the Dead Sea, which is over to the right, that little area over there, you can't see it. So here is a larger map. Should have prepared this beforehand, but I thought it would have the lines. But anyway, this gives you some time to study the map out. So anyway, if you look at the Dead Sea area, which is that kind of lake area to the right in the most recent screenshot, and then you go westward a little bit, kind of in the middle of those mountain areas, kind of from the middle of the Dead Sea westward a bit, then you see the Oaks of Mamre. It's not labeled, but it's there. You'll see the Oaks of Mamre, and you'll also see Beersheba, kind of southwest of that, which will become very important in the story later on. And you'll also see Shur, which was mentioned in verse 1, along with Kadesh, which is basically short for Kadesh Barnea. You also see Gerar marked there as well. So let me give you the map with the lines. These aren't fancy route lines, these are just straight lines I drew in. So that little box there starting at kind of westward of the Dead Sea, that one lake there, that is where Abraham is starting in Hebron, the Oaks of Mamre. And then he travels southwest somewhere between Shur and Kadesh. You don't know exactly where, but he traveled there, settled there for some time, and then he went up northeast to the land of Gerar, which is in the region of Philistia. And we see that Abraham is sojourning in the land of the Philistines. So that's pretty much verse 1. Hopefully that makes sense. Sorry about the time it took to get those lines in there, but gave you more time to look at the map, because geography is fun, right? So in Gerar, he meets Abimelech, the king of Gerar, and sent and took Sarah, most likely because of the same issue, that she was a beautiful woman, just like Pharaoh's people saw her as, so did Abimelech and his people. However, we see some issues here, and the first issue that I want to bring up is in verses 5 to 6. So if we look at, first of all, verse 18, all the way at the end, and verse 17, God healed Abimelech and his wife and his maids so that they bore children. So Abimelech is already married, and yet when we look at verse 5 and 6, did he not himself say to me, she is my sister, and she herself said, he is my brother? And Abimelech says, in the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands I have done this. And God says, yes, I know that in the integrity of your heart you have done this, and I have also kept you from sinning against me. So my question to you guys, first of all, is how do we reconcile what God says about Abimelech's actions in that Abimelech already had a wife and now tries to take another wife? Polygamy. Is God saying that that is okay, and that's something that you can do in the integrity of your heart and the innocence of your hands? What do you guys think? Yeah? All right. So basically, is God not applying the same consistent standard to Abimelech, since he's not really a Christian yet? Is that what you're saying? Hmm. All right. Yeah, it's a tricky question, and there are a number of good things that you said there. I also want to point out that with the kings specifically, you mentioned David and Solomon a lot, there's a specific law in the Mosaic law that says kings should not be taking many wives for themselves. And for the other people have said a lot of good things in the chat too. Hat says polygamy isn't ever banned that she's seen, perhaps not explicitly exactly. And Enley points out a good thing there. He would have brought the sin of adultery to Abraham's house. And that is the sin that is being looked at in this passage. And I think that's important. And it helps frame everything else in the question that I asked earlier on, is polygamy okay according to this passage? I don't think the passage is addressing polygamy at all. It's actually focusing on the sin of adultery that would have occurred if Abimelech took Abraham's wife. That would have resulted in adultery on the parts of Abraham as well as his wife there. So first of all, we're obviously not talking, when we say, okay, blamelessness, when we talk about integrity of heart, and when we talk about innocence of hands, we're not talking about Abimelech's whole life, right? Let's get that out of the way first. Abimelech is not a perfectly sinless person. What we're actually talking about is much more specific than Abimelech's whole life, and it's, I think, more specific than his actions in that whole day. It's more specific than polygamy. It's actually just referring to the adultery sin that would have occurred. So that's how I would take that passage. I don't think we're really told whether a polygamy is permissible or not, actually. And it would seem that all of the narrative passages in the Bible that do show polygamy, such as the first one, Lamech, having 2 wives, that didn't end well and he wasn't a good person. We also see Abraham taking Hagar as well, and that didn't end well for anyone, really, and definitely didn't end well for Israel for many years to come either. And in these narrative passages, usually what we see, instead of a explicit moral judgment about, okay, this was right, this was wrong, you should do this, you shouldn't do that, what we see are consequences. And those consequences often give us a hint as to whether something was morally good or morally bad. So that's how I would take that passage. I don't think we're told at all whether polygamy was acceptable or not. Even with this pagan nation, this Philistine nation, and Abimelech, who wasn't under the law at the time, definitely wasn't Christian, of course, but he wasn't even under the law at this time. The law hadn't been written during this time. But that's how I would take it, at least. It did help Israel multiply a lot. Children were extremely important in the ancient world, and that led to multiple wives and concubines and things like that to get as many children, as much power and help and labor and support as they could. So it had practical benefits, polygamy did, but I don't think we're given a moral judgment either way on it. Any other thoughts that you guys had on polygamy? But yeah, it did cause a lot of quarrels between wives, between the husband and things like that. Another interesting note, though, is that you said kind of lord of the house. It was very uncommon for a poor man to have multiple wives because he just couldn't support multiple wives. This was more of a thing among the rich people, more a thing among the kings as well. And after Samuel in the Bible, we don't see polygamy at all except among a few kings. We don't see that mentioned among kind of the regular people. But yeah, your example about the fighting applies right in with Genesis, Hagar and Abraham, Ishmael and Sarah. Yeah, we'll actually be reading that just in the next chapter. More quarrels. But alright, we'll move on from the polygamy topic. I think we covered that well enough. I really think he's just specifically talking about the sin of adultery, which is something that, according to our commentary in the ancient Near East, they would have recognized that as sinful and bad and wrong because children in the household and wives were so important. They actually viewed adultery as sinful. They didn't really view polygamy as sinful. So I think that's what's in view here, and that is what God is referring to when he says, in the integrity of your heart, you have done this. He's talking about against the sin of adultery, not talking about polygamy. There's just nothing said about that here, I don't think. All right, later on in the chapter, we see the same issue as before in chapter 12. Abraham is acting deceitfully, and verse 7 is interesting because it is the first time that we see the word prophet in the Bible. Now therefore, restore the man's wife, for he is a prophet, as God says to Abimelech. He will pray for you and you will live. Now, this is a very clear passage that we get in seeing that prophets are not perfectly sinless, but especially on certain occasions, they do speak directly for the Lord and act as his intermediary and kind of pray for other people, do things like that. They didn't really have the office of prophet at this particular time, especially when you think of the prophets like Elijah and Elisha doing these signs and miracles and things like that. Abraham, he's pretty low-key as a prophet, just praying for Abimelech. And that's pretty much chapter 20. Any final questions before we move on? Yeah, we'll get to the lambs, and we'll see Abimelech again in the next chapter as well. So chapter 21, just going through the list, we have Trinity next. So Trinity, could you please read chapter 21, just all of it? All right, thanks. So that was chapter 21, and in the previous chapter, chapter 20, we saw the issues with adultery and how that was such a horrible thing that God had closed the wombs of Abimelech's wife and his maids and his household there. And now in chapter 21, we see the problems with polygamy, and we see a lot of quarreling between Ishmael and Isaac, though Isaac was just a baby, he didn't know what was going on most likely. But Ishmael, he's mocking the child, he's mocking the birth and everything like that. And Ishmael would probably be about 14 years old by this time. We know that he was circumcised when Abraham was 99 years old and Ishmael was 13 years old. And then we had pretty much a 1 year duration of time before Isaac was then born. So Ishmael would probably be about 14 years old by this time. And then he's sent out from his household. He's just given a little pack of water and some things. Even though Abraham was a very wealthy and rich person, he just gave them a couple little things. And he is told by God that, they'd be safe and be all right. But he still just gives them a little bit of bread, skin of water, gave them to Hagar, put him on her shoulder, gave her the boy, and sent her away. And after that, we get into Abimelech again. He comes back. He's bringing Phicol, the commander of his army, and he spoke to Abraham, saying, verse 22, God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me. So it's not really because of Abraham himself that Abimelech is coming back to him and says, okay, let's make a little treaty, let's make a little agreement here. It's really because of God. He sees God's blessings on Abraham. I mean, from Abimelech's previous encounter with Abraham, he probably doesn't think that Abraham is a great person to deal with, dealt falsely with him, and, caused a lot of harm and a lot of bad stuff to his household, at least temporarily. But because of God, Abimelech is reaching out to Abraham. And we also see specifically says, don't deal falsely with me. Kind of hinting at, you dealt falsely with me before, so let's make sure that you won't do that again. And like Biget has been saying, we do see the 7 ewe lambs being brought as an agreement because, they have some quarrels between the servants of Abimelech and Abraham, and probably his servants as well, over a well of water. So there's an issue with that, and so they make a covenant, and he specifically sets aside 7 ewe lambs for the well. And yeah, he was probably scared too. I mean, it's not often that you get a dream from God who pronounces judgment and death upon you and judgment on your entire nation, and also coming with that the physical sign of closing the wombs of his wife and maidservants. So yeah, he was probably scared as well. All right, any questions on that chapter? Yeah, you could take that in a couple different ways. So we are told by God in verse 12 that he says to Abraham, whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her, for through Isaac your descendants shall be named. Don't be worried about the lad and your maid. So we are told that, but we're not told that Sarah tells Abraham just only a piece of bread and a skin of water. So perhaps Abraham is just so confident in God's promises that he only needs to get a little piece of bread and a skin of water. He knows they'll be fine. Or perhaps, on the other hand, he's just acting arrogantly or stingy and not giving them as much as he definitely could have given them a lot more. But yeah, you could take that in a couple different ways, I think. It's interesting. So Biget says, perhaps option number 2, maybe he was just arrogant and being stingy. Yeah, it could certainly be that as well. Abraham does seem to be very trusting in God, especially when he's going to sacrifice his son Isaac in the very next chapter that we'll read. And he does think very simply about it. He doesn't worry too much about it. Oh, God says this, so I'll just do that. Sometimes, at least. Other times he runs around and acts deceitfully. But he does seem to be a very simple person, so that could be it. And Trinity suggests perhaps Sarah only wanted them to have that much. We're not given that explicit information that Sarah said so, but we are told that whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her. So perhaps that's referring to the entire event, including what Abraham should give them for their journey as well. So that's another genuine possibility. So Genesis chapter 21:14, in a sermon that Snorlax heard, some people were not meant to be in your life, such as Hagar in Abraham's life. He took care of Hagar before sending her off. And, we can draw some applications from this as well. And actually in Galatians, Paul draws an analogy between this story and how the sons of God should act. So, we could make that application. We do know that Hagar was causing problems for Abraham, for sure. On the other hand, we also know that this wasn't just any random person or friend or stranger or, just anyone in your life. It was Abraham's son, and that's why the matter distressed him so greatly, as well as someone who he had sexual relations with. It wasn't just anyone. It wasn't just a friend. It wasn't just a stranger or anything like that. So it does feel like he required God's specific message. Okay, don't worry about what happens to these people who are your family. So I'll take care of them. But yeah, it's an interesting thing. It's certainly true, though, that there are some people not meant to be in your life. And yeah, we can make a light application from Hagar and Abraham sending her off to some of the people in our own lives. Certainly possible, I think. Especially when God makes the explicit promise vocally that he will take care of them when you send them away, and that you should send them away to listen to Sarah, whatever she tells you. But yeah, I would just say be careful with that application, especially if you're a father and you have a son who needs to be taken care of. You don't just kick him out of the house when he's like 14 years old. But yeah, careful application. I think that's possible. All right, so that was chapter 21. We see the issues with polygamy, and we see Ishmael and Hagar being kicked out. And then we see Phicol and Abimelech making their appearance, because they're still in the land of the Philistines. And if you look at the map, Beersheba, of which the wilderness of Beersheba, where Hagar went to, that's nearby. It's close to Gerar, which we last heard Abraham was in. And it's just a little south, go down southeast a little bit, you'll see Beersheba. And we also kind of see Abraham moving along the area of Beersheba. So he seems to be moving down into the southeastern kind of area into Beersheba, but not where the wilderness of Beersheba is, where Hagar and Ishmael are. All right, let's get into chapter 22. This is the last chapter that we'll look at today. And we have Matt on there, though Tia said she wanted to read, so we'll have Tia read next, and then Matt could probably close us out with a prayer. So Tia, could you please read all of chapter 22? It's all right. Perfect. And thanks for reading that. So that was chapter 22, and the sacrifice of Isaac, at least attempted sacrifice, though I think it was certainly a sacrifice as far as Abraham's own will, possession, and desires go. But the attempted sacrifice of Isaac, and God was testing Abraham, and verse 2, he's really like laying on the emphasis there. Take now your son, not just any son, your only son, not just any only son, the one you love, Isaac, and go ahead and offer him there as a burnt offering. And Abraham, as Matt has said, very simple man it seems, he just goes ahead and does it. And they're going to Mount Moriah. And I sent a map a little bit earlier. So this one actually has the little line route for it, the little orange line. So we have Beersheba, which you'll kind of remember from our last map, kind of southeast of Gerar, and Abraham was in that area. He travels all the way up to Mount Moriah there. And then he travels back to Beersheba after the offering was completed. So there's really a lot in this passage, and one thing that I would like to bring up, at least, is that is a question, really. It's a question for you guys. Was it okay for God to test Abraham in this manner? To say, okay, go ahead and sacrifice, kill your son for me. Was it okay for God to ask Abraham to do that? And why? Yeah. Yeah, so you brought up some background information, and just to kind of expand on that about child sacrifice, this was something that was done during Abraham's time, and so perhaps one of the reasons why, sacrifice your son Isaac, that particular test was chosen, was so that God could show that as a specific example and use that to say that he is not for child sacrifice, but is against it. And there's some other things as well that you said. I think we should go a little further though, but it was definitely, a good start. God was testing Abraham, testing his obedience, but that alone I don't think is enough to say that it was okay. For instance, if I was an employer and I had a number of employees and we had a team building experience for loyalty and obedience to the company, I'll say to the employees, all right, bring your only sons to the meeting next week, and we'll offer them up as sacrifices. But wait, I'm thinking in my head, I'll stop them from doing so. And so then I think we get to Tia's answer, which helps with that. When you mentioned that too, Matt. But Tia's answer, it's because God knew nothing bad would happen in the end. So this wasn't just a test of any kind that's not in a perfect environment. Like for instance, if I was administering a test to someone, I don't know what's going to happen. And if it's something dangerous, I neither have the omnipotence nor the omniscience to stop it from happening. So Tia's answer is another good thing that we can add on to that. And another thing that we can add on to that, I would say, is that God gives life and takes away. He is more than just in his position as God to choose who gets to live and who gets to die, because he gives life and because we are sinful and deserving of death as well. So, he can do whatever he wants, as the psalm says. And finally, basically talking about what we mentioned before, he can stop something from happening with 100% surety because of his omnipotence and because of his omniscience. He knows what's going to happen. He has the power to do and to stop things from happening as well. And I think Beget is bringing some good stuff up there too. It was to test Abraham's faithfulness to God and see if he would be willing to give up what he most held dear. And that's why we had all that emphasis in the first section. Take your son, your only son, the son whom you love, Isaac. So yeah, that's what the whole test was for. That's another good question, Enley. So you brought up two really good things there. Abraham knew that God could raise him up again, and it was a foreshadowing of Christ. So this had all a portion in God's entire salvific plan. Let's talk about the Temple Mount real quick, though. Mount Moriah, yes, this was the location of the Temple Mount. So it's just another interesting thing that the Temple Mount would be on the same place where we have this first offering from Abraham. And we do know that this sacrifice, this offering of Isaac, had massive significance for the entire ceremonial and sacrificial laws of the Old Testament, and for a very long time afterwards as well, where we not only talk about sacrificing something that had value, something that you held dear, like the best lamb from your flock or whatever, but also the idea of substitution as well. So instead of Isaac being sacrificed, we had a substitute that God provided, an animal in this particular instance, but later on we see the same theme of sacrifice and substitution with Christ, who is God's only Son, whom the Father loves. Very interesting stuff there. And I'll just go ahead and read a little bit from the commentary, if I can find it. So out of this event, Israel developed a major theological teaching. Whenever an animal was offered on the holy mountain of God, God remembered Isaac. In other words, the believer knew that the sacrifice he was offering was a substitute, and that the true sacrifice that was pleasing to God was a broken heart, his heart broken of self-will and surrendered to God. That was what Abraham had to do, and that was what God was looking for in Abraham. And that surrender would be best expressed by offering the best that could be given to God, Abraham's son. But there was a substitute given in his place. And their commentary also says that the passage anticipates God's substituting his only son for all humanity, making the perfect sacrifice once and for all. John certainly had this in mind when he introduced Jesus as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. It is important to note that the focus of Genesis 22 is not on the doctrine of atonement, though. Rather, it's portraying an obedient servant worshiping God in faith at great cost, and then receiving God's provision. Abraham did not withhold his son from God. And kind of along the lines of what Matt said, I just want to mention real quickly, Abraham, very simple person, he just supposed that God could raise him from the dead, his son, if he went ahead and gone through the sacrifice. But yeah, it's very interesting stuff. And one last thing that I want to bring up are just a few applications and timeless truths from this passage itself. But first, let me ask you guys, because the commentary has a few of them, but I want to ask you guys first. What's one application that you can draw out of this passage? How would you apply it to your life? Yeah, it was a good application. It was looking at the principles of the passage, applying that to your life in a personal fashion. But if any of your applications was, I should go to Mount Moriah, take my one and only son with me, then you probably got the wrong application. But that was a good one. And I think we can go ahead and close it out. Unless anyone else wants to say their application, there's still time for that. Or if you have any questions on anything that we looked at in the previous chapters, or this chapter. All right, so Matt, again, we're back to you in the list. So Matt, could you close us out with a word of prayer? Amen. Thank you all for being here. Had a great time with you guys. We get the age of Ishmael, your question, Rami, from Genesis chapter 17, I think. Real quickly. Yeah, Genesis chapter 17, verse 25. Ishmael, his son, was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. Then 1 year passed according to the promise in chapter 18. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised with Ishmael. And then 1 year passed, he was 100 years old, as we're told by the text. So we can imply and infer Ishmael's 14 years old during that time in the passages that we just read. All right. Thank you all again. I'll see you next week.